Welcome back to another episode of the Most Dangerous Podcast Players. It's been quite a whirlwind so far researching and analyzing these cases, and this week was no easier. This week in our Warren Files season, we're headed back to the United States to take a look at the case that started it all for me, Caitlin. We're going to be looking at the Snedeker family. Our research assistant Jessie pored over the internet for days, finding all the facts that she could, and after analyzing, well, we just want to preface that this could get a little controversial. Buckle up, players, because it's time for another dive into the infamous world of the paranormal.
Perhaps you're hearing the family name Snedeker and thinking, damn, that sounds familiar. Well, it probably does. The Snedeker family haunting was the inspiration for the 2002 Discovery Channel documentary, A Haunting in Connecticut, and the 2009 film, The Haunting in Connecticut, starring Virginia Madsen and Kyle Gallner. But before we talk about those catastrophes, we want to do what we do with every episode and give you a little background on the family. The Snedeker case includes 6 different family members: Alan, Carmen, Philip, Jennifer, Bradley, and a cousin, Tammy. In the summer of 1986, parents Alan, sometimes referred to as Al, and Carmen moved their family to the small town of Southington, Connecticut. At the time, their oldest son Philip was suffering from Hodgkin's lymphoma, and they wanted to be closer to the University of Connecticut where he was being treated. Due to the nature of the treatments and their son's condition requiring constant attention, the family was suffering financially, and this house was the perfect size, perfect location, and best of all, the perfect price. Everything was turning out to be wonderful. Or was it?
The house that they moved into, as it turns out, used to be a funeral home. The discovery was made shortly after moving into the home when Al went down into the basement, which was sectioned up into several different rooms, one of which housed various embalming tables and tools. The basement was the only room large enough for the brothers Philip and Bradley to share and occupy as a bedroom, so they slept what would have been the casket display room. It's a little bit creepy. From there, though, things started getting weird. Carmen states the house seemed like it was playing tricks on them. Things like items disappearing, children reported seeing people walking around the house, they heard voices, and they would hear what sounded like hundreds of birds taking flight at the same time. All of this seems relatively harmless. But then, Philip began showcasing massive personality shifts and began to withdraw himself from the family and became very angry, and at times he would write poetry with necrophiliac themes. There are even reports that at one point, Philip had one of the most intense episodes of anger that they had seen, and he attempted to rape his cousin Tammy. At this point, the family had him taken in by the police to have a medical evaluation done, and he was pronounced schizophrenic. Philip was removed from the house and seemed to be getting better at the treatment center, until he moved back home.
Before we dive into the Warrens and the subsequent documentary and film based on the case, we want to introduce some of the paranormal phenomenons that happened in the house. Some of these reports include lights turning on and off, but having no bulbs screwed in. Carmen had a shower curtain wrap around her face to the point where Tammy needed to come rescue her. Mop water turning blood red, the sense of rotting flesh and decay throughout the house, and probably the worst report from the family, and let this serve as a trigger warning for some of our players, repeated and brutal rape of both Carmen and her niece Tammy, as well as acts of sodomy being performed on Al by unseen entities. Carmen said she would witness a hand going up her niece's nightshirt, and that she would hear a hideous laugh when it would leave the room. This is obviously a horrendous thing to have to discuss and extremely uncomfortable, we know, but we do have to consider these things when we are discussing these cases. Out of all the cases we've looked into so far, these are by far the most gruesome experiences we've heard. The family claims that the moment they moved in, Philip said the house was evil. He claims to have heard voices the moment they moved in and would see a man in the basement and could give great detail as to what he even looked like. The last report that contributed to Carmen reaching out for help were two entities that were seen around the home. From the description, it seems to have been two men, although the detail isn't confirmed, but one entity had long black hair and black eyes. The other had white hair and white eyes and wore a pinstripe tuxedo. Both were extremely unsettling to see and absolutely frightened Carmen to death. Finally, she ended up reaching out for help.
Ed and Lorraine Warren came to the home a few years after the hauntings began and investigated, later proclaiming that the house was possessed and, just as the Enfield case, the media swarmed the house and the family. Over a total of 9 weeks, the Warrens and a few other investigators worked in the house, rating it a 9 out of 10 on the evilness seen within the home. They, along with the other researchers, believed that the former employees of the funeral home were performing acts of necrophilia, which led to the evil presence in the home. This, although said by Carmen to be true, was never, ever proven to be true. The Warrens claimed that the house was infested with demons and arranged for the home to be exorcised. The house was cleansed, and a few years later, the Snedeker family moved out to a new home. It was after the family had moved out that the Warrens allegedly paired the family up with Ray Garton, who wrote the 1992 best-selling book In a Dark Place: The Story of a True Haunting. Garton worked with the family closely, interviewing them one at a time to make sure he was getting all angles of the story. It was then that he realized the members of the Snedeker family had very, very differing stories, almost like they couldn't keep the story straight. Garton reached out to the Warrens about this issue, to which Ed reportedly said, "Oh, they're crazy. You've got some of the story, just use what works and make the rest up. Just make it up and make it scary." Garton, a little disappointed at this, continued to work on the novel and with the family, and did exactly as he was told by Ed. The Snedeker family continued to stand by their story. However, there is little to no proof that anything they said actually happened. The novel then sparked a documentary and a film, to which Lorraine says is very, very loosely based on the actual investigation, which now leads us into the controversy of the Snedeker case.
Just as with the Amityville House investigation, there have been numerous claims by people that have lived in the house before and even after the Snedeker family that claim that there have never been any evil entities. The Snedeker family actually claimed that they had zero knowledge of the home once being a funeral parlor, to which the owner later refuted, saying that they were all well aware of the home's history before moving in. In fact, it has even been stated that Carmen knew it was a funeral home before they moved in, but since no one died at the home, she figured it would be fine. As stated previously, Garton, who wrote the novel about the family's experience, said it seemed like the family members couldn't keep their stories straight and ended up having to fabricate a lot of the things in the novel. In several interviews, Carmen claims that she had no idea what was happening, as it was the kids who were being tormented. However, she also claims to have been a victim of these hauntings. So, what's the real story there? Along with that, the horrific claims of physical abuse being done to her, her husband, and her niece would be more than enough evidence for us to up and leave the house, no questions asked. But the family endured this torture for roughly 3 years. The family claims it's because the landlord would not let them break the lease, but honestly, in our opinion, if that fact was actually true, we wouldn't care at all and just leave. So if the family was so terrified, why not do as the Lutz family did and just get out? There are reports that Al and Carmen's stories would contradict each other, and neighbors said none of this was happening until they got behind on the rent. Eventually, other facts emerged that point to the Schnedeker's eldest son, Philip, to be a big component in this case. Philip was diagnosed with schizophrenia, suffered from a drug addiction, and was also suffering from Hodgkin's lymphoma. He was undergoing cobalt treatments, radiation, and he actually admits to being the culprit of some of the vile things that went on in the home. Now, at first we thought maybe this was a side effect of all the treatments his body was enduring, but no. Philip's oncologist said that there were no chances of any of that from the treatments or medications. As much as we believe in the paranormal, we believe more in the truth. And science and medicine really can't be beaten in this instance.
According to the current home's owner, Susan Trotta Smith, the home is not and never was haunted. At the time of the interview we found, she had been living in the home for 10 years and claimed that the house is wonderful and that the Snedeker family was nothing but a Hollywood facade. The only plague the family owns are that of onlookers, tourists, and those that are interested in seeing the home. Today, many people flock to the home the Snedeker family claims to have tormented them, taking pictures and even coming up to the house and knocking on the door to tell the children the house is haunted. Carmen is now a spiritual advisor and is in the process of working on another book based on her experiences. However, her co-author that was slated to work with her has since left the project and distanced himself from Carmen. We will get into our opinions of the case in just a moment, but before we do, we want to bring up the film that was developed around the family's stories. We do realize that there was a 2002 documentary created, but we want to discuss the 2009 film, The Haunting in Connecticut, as it was my inspiration into diving into the paranormal and is apparently very, very wrong. The film does change the names of the family members, which isn't really a big deal, but we did want to preface that before we begin breaking down the various scenes, because I'll be referring to their actual names rather than the movie names. In the film, it's shown that Philip would see the ghost of a young boy who was later identified as Jonah, who would perform in seances and was able to produce ectoplasm. False. This was a fictional character created by the filmmakers to add an additional supernatural element to the movie. Adding on to that, in the film it shows that there were bodies buried within the walls of the home and were found as Philip is burning down the home to rid the evil entity of this world. False, and even more false. There were no bodies in the wall, and Philip did not try to burn down the home. Again, this was all a ruse by Hollywood to add more theatricality to the film. Even the scene with the shower curtain isn't fully correct, as it was Carmen who claims to have been trapped in the curtain, not her niece. The final thing we want to discuss with the inaccuracy of the film is Philip's cancer magically disappearing. At the time the film was released, Philip was in fact in remission, but it wasn't by some magic or by ridding the house of evil. It was from the many, many different treatments he was receiving. However, his cancer did unfortunately come back, and Philip passed away on August 9th, 2012, leaving behind his wife and 4 children. So, Lorraine says that the film is very loosely based on the investigation, but since the majority of the film is completely 100% false, how much of it was actually even real? And before we go into our final thoughts on this case, we do want to have a moment of silence for Philip Snedeker.
Okay, players, the time is finally here. Before we give our final opinion on this case, we want to quickly reiterate that this is just our opinion, and we base it all on the facts of the case. In the instance of the Snedeker case, it wasn't very hard to come to a conclusion. However, it was hard to come up with how to properly word the reasoning behind our final verdict. But we'll do our best. But our final verdict for the Snedeker family is this. It was a total hoax. This is not to say that perhaps maybe there was a small amount of poltergeist activity going on that initially got the family nervous, but when things got worse and worse with their son Philip, perhaps it was easier to put the blame on something unseen rather than see their son continue to succumb to his various diseases. The fact that the family has been accused of falling behind on rent and were reaping in lots of money from the attention that the alleged activity was receiving, it all just kind of makes sense that they would build up this humongous facade and play it out until the very last drop. This was a difficult case, as there were a lot of controversial things surrounding it, and a lot of controversial claims from the family on top of that. But the truth is what ultimately matters for us when we do these episodes. Next week, we continue the Warren Files and take on the case that has inspired The Conjuring 3, which is set to come out this upcoming September. The Devil Made Me Do It, the case of Arne Cheyenne Johnson. So, stay tuned, players, because we're just getting started.